Hello, 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 hello. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back to another episode. Is this really an episode? Is that what we call this? I don't know what you call it. Edition, session of something, of plant consciousness commentary. It's great to have you here. Yeah, it's Friday. It's a little later than we normally meet because I just got out of the Plant Wisdom Book Club discussion. We were having our first mini discussion on Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life by Marta McDowell. That's the name of the author. So we were just having our first conversation on that, and it was quite lovely. If you don't know about the Plant Wisdom Book Club, but if you like reading books, then head over to my website. You will find it underneath the different courses and activities that I have. And the Plant Wisdom Book Club is it's in the Naturally Conscious community, which we talk about all the time here. And it's in the Naturally Conscious community. It is we read one book every 2 months, and then we have 3 calls during the period of 2 months to discuss the book. And I have to say, I am extremely grateful for this book club because we have read, I think this is book number 19. So we've been together for a while. And I love reading these books together with the group because I always get so much out of it. There's so much depth, new things to think about, just so many things that I never even thought of. So, or ways of looking at the book that's different than the way that I originally saw it. So it's always great. So if you like reading books, please come over to the Naturally Conscious community and join Seedling Sprouts, where you have the Plant Wisdom Book Club. Again, it's all on my website. So anyways, but that's not what we're here for today. Today, we are here to talk about plant consciousness. I have an article and a paper to talk about today. So we have another twofer, which I hope will go because I think we have enough time to cover it all. And the reason why is because I was just going to go with the paper. And then I was like, do I really want this paper? And then I switched over I was looking for what was next on my list, which is very long. And today I found like 2 or 3 really good ones also. And then I came across this article and I was like, oh, this article would be perfect to then reintroduce, to like be the sort of preview to this paper. So anyway, so that's what I decided to do. But if you're new around here, please make sure you do all the important things, hit subscribe, hit like, hit the notification bell if you're watching on YouTube, like all of that important stuff. Please make sure that you do that because that way you get to hear everything that comes out new, whether we're talking about the Plant Wisdom Book Club, Plant Wisdom Book Club. I was just talking about the book club, the Plant Consciousness commentary every Friday, as well as the Reconnect with Plant Wisdom podcast, which also comes out every week. So if you don't know me, hi. I don't have like a whole fancy bumper introduction piece. So I'll just tell you who I am. I am Tigria Gardenia, and I am a nature-inspired mentor and a certified life coach. And I have a master's in vegetal future. So some call me the world ambassador for plant advocacy. I love all things plants. And we are here to talk about all things plants. We're going to dive into a new, like I said, article. And then from the article, we're going to be talking about this paper. And just from the title, you're going to tell why I picked this. It's without any doubt, as soon as you see the title, you will understand exactly why I decided that this was the one we were going to be doing today. So let me prep everything up here. And let me open this up for you. Here it is. No, that's not a good one. This one. This is better. So this is a paper from the Ethnobotany, I believe. Is that what it is? Hold on. The Ethnobotanical Assembly, TEA, or T, which is a magazine that comes out quarterly. And this is an article called Finding the Plantness Within Ourselves. This article is from 2021. As you know, if you've been here for a while, you know that we go through different papers and articles and different studies, all connected to plants, plant intelligence, plant critical studies, performance in plants, art in plants, plant co-creation, all things plant from the perspective of plants as persons and plants that are as partners. So, and I've been going through all of these mainly in sort of chronological order, because in the world of critical plant studies, it's been an unfolding as the academic world and as the scientific, as well as also the artistic world, stops looking at plants as objects. Well, at least some do, and starts to see plants as partners. So the order kind of makes sense, and it's important because as we go through these papers, you'll see that there's this developing understanding that plants are individuals, that plants are sentient, that plants are intelligent, and for some, that plants are conscious. So if you go back on my website, I actually recently put I put up all the old sessions that we have of plant consciousness commentary. So now you can go back to if you go to my website, tigreagardenia.com/blog, you will find all of them. Most of them are inside of the Naturally Conscious community, but you're going to want to join the Naturally Conscious community anyway, because that is the place where we are having all of these discussions. This is where we're talking about what it's like to grow and build. It is a safe and sacred space for us to be able to talk about a life where we are co-creators with the plant world and with the plant kin home. So there's so much stuff going on there. Like I said, the book club I was talking about earlier, as well as courses and activities and events and a writing group and a creativity and all kinds of different aspects. So go check out the Naturally Conscious community. Plus, it's the place to continue on these conversations on a regular basis. All right. We have a lot to go through with this paper, with this different article, as well as the paper. So let's just dive into this, because I feel like we could be talking here for hours. I could be talking for hours, right? You're just going to be commenting. And we love your comments, by the way. I love your comments. Please, if you're watching, if you're a sprout that's watching, please, let us know in the comments. Who are you? Where are you coming from? And again, remember to do all the YouTube-y stuff. Hit like, hit, the subscribe button, share to your friends. We like all that stuff. That stuff is good. Okay. I like how I'm talking about I like all that stuff. But all right, let's get into this, because I don't know why I'm feeling kind of weird in the way that I'm talking about things today. And I just need to dive in. You know me, I have to get revved up. It takes me a minute to completely get revved up. Okay, so this is in a section called Plant Thinking, which already tells you something. It's called Finding the Plantness Within Ourselves by Danielle Sands and Daniel Whistler. Like I said, this is from 2021, which is connected also to the paper that we're going to be talking about afterwards. So let's get into it. How can a plant readily... Oh, sorry. I have to stop and say this. The reason that this article really caught my attention more than anything... I'm sorry, my mouse is acting weird. Okay, the reason this paper really caught my attention more than anything is the whole plantness within ourselves. If you've taken the I Am Plant Challenge, or if you've spent any time in the Naturally Conscious community, you know that a big aspect of working closely with plants is the reawakening of your own inner plantness. Your own inner plantness is that part of you that thinks differently, acts differently. The fact that you are able to see the world as an ecosystem, you're able to deal better with what's happening in the world around you, create different relationships, all those aspects of ourselves that we've basically have forgotten or lost, mainly forgotten. And so really reawakening the plantness is such an important aspect, or our inner vegetality, in order for us to create lives where we can deal with things, where we can be resilient, where we can create connections that are not based on conditioning, that are not based on fear, but are instead based on reciprocal relationships of whatever type that need to be created. So this article really caught my attention because of this, because I feel like this is such an important topic, and it's one that very rarely is being talked about. We're talking a lot about who the plants are, and we're talking about how plants help us better understand society, but we are not necessarily talking about how working working directly with plants is helping us better understand ourselves. So that's the reason why I wanted to go through this. All right, let's get into it. How can a plant readily know us? Hold on. Why are you? I have something that's like popping up on my screen and I cannot figure out. There it is. Okay. Okay. How can a plant readily know us? Monica Galliano asks, when we are hardly aware of the plantness within ourselves. For those of you that don't know who, I don't know if she's going to explain it, but I'll explain to you. If you don't know who Monica Galliano is, if you're new here, so Monica Galliano is a researcher. She is a native Italian born, actually only about 45 minutes from where I live right now in Turin, and she lives in Australia. She has written about a book called Thus Spoke the Plant. She has done a lot of research into the idea of plant cognition and is one of the premier sort of scientists that is working on the fact that plants are cognizant and has developed plant bioacoustics as well as plant cognition as a field. So very important figure if you're into the world of plants and trying to understand plants. Let's make this. Can I make this bigger? No, it does this weird thing. It still keeps the margins. All right. Galliano's query, posed in service of a rediscovery of such plantness, reflects the growing interest in plant life across the humanities during the last decade. Some of this interest has emerged under the moniker plant thinking. Really? Plant thinking? No. No. Plant intelligence, plant consciousness, plant cognition, but not plant thinking, but whatever, which variously names the way in which plants think, the way in which we think about plants, and the potentially transformative effect of plant life on the practice of thinking itself. Critics frame these distinctions in diverse ways. Galliano, Ryan, and Vieira thus distinguish between extrinsic language, devised and articulated by humans in response to plants, and intrinsic language, encompassing the visual, oral, and biochemical expression between plants and with other beings. This comes from, these three are the editors for the Mind of Plants, which again was one of our selections in the Plant Wisdom Book Club. So it's a really interesting book made up of, I think 26-ish, maybe plus 3, I think. Short stories that are all written about from the point of view of plants, and definitely a wide variety of thinking, as well as from the human perspective, as well as from the plant perspective. Definitely a worthy, interesting read. Galliano's call to attend to the plantness within marks out a trajectory, an adventure from plant as object of thinking, inspiring extrinsic language, to plant as a model for thinking via careful observation of intrinsic language, and finally to shared human and plant participation in a mode of thinking which bridges and transcends the extrinsic and the intrinsic. This essay begins to explore that trajectory. Disillusioned by the combination of a scientific practice which disarticulates plants as subjects and a cultural Shintism, a cultural Shintism, which discredits other modes of knowledge, Galliano turns to indigenous narratives and practices. She explicitly draws on religious and mystic tropes, aligning plant discovery and self-discovery through an inward journey, and thereby thematizes the trope of interiority in a way that feels surprising, ironic, and even jarring in the context of Western intellectual tradition. For this tradition, plants have repeatedly been identified with pure exteriority, serving as a supplementary counter to the richness of human interior experience. The classical German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel is often used as an exemplar of the philosophical tradition's disdain for plants. The plant kingdom is, he avers, inferior to the animal kingdom because, unlike animal subjectivity, the plant does not hold itself aloof from its inorganic nature. It is not such a self. It lacks the inwardness with which would be free. This is in 2004. Remember how I was saying earlier that in the work that we've been doing here, in the reviews and the understanding that we've been doing in the plant consciousness commentary every week, I've been going in chronological order. And this is part of the reason why, because it is extremely important to understand the thinking that has predated where we are today in order for you to truly value how important it is where we have finally arrived. Mind you, we were just, as I said, discussing Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, which is a book that was written present day, obviously, about Emily Dickinson, who was born in the 1830s and lived all the way through to the 1890s. So in that period alone, Emily Dickinson herself, actually, there was a movement to try to recognize the intelligence of plants, and that fell flat. In other words, there was this understanding that plants had a rich life, and therefore, there must be more to the creation of this rich life than just the individual sort of static nature of which we think about when we think about plants in nature, that we think about them as without subjectivity, as Hegel said. That fell flat. Then around the 1960s, we have the new movement that comes up around the secret life of plants with Cleve Baxter and his experiments that tries to show that plants have different abilities and different perceptions. And that then falls flat because the scientific community steps in and tries to reproduce the experiments that Cleve Baxter did, but from an optics of pure mechanistic science, which breaks many of the connections that were necessary in order to truly understand and experience what Cleve Baxter was doing as a non-scientist in that traditional way. I mean, he was an expert in polygraph, and therefore he had an intrinsic relationship with plants that were very different from the mechanistic scientists that came after him and tried to replicate his studies, who also wanted the studies to fail, to be honest. So that's another piece of it. Then fast forward through 2004, all the way to 2006, when you have the first of the male scientists, pardon me for saying this for a second, who start to throw up a flare that's saying, hey, folks, we've been working with plants for a long time, and we're seeing things that you're not recognizing. Specifically, we are recognizing that plants have an ability to understand their environment that requires subjectivity in order to get there. In other words, the plant has to be able to recognize themselves within the environment in order to be able to do the things that a plant does in the environment. In other words, it's impossible for me to make a choice if I don't know that I am the subject of that choice. So this time frame is extremely important. We started Plant Consciousness Commentary with papers from 2006, right after something like this comes out, because we want to show the progression of, hey, we're seeing something here to where exactly we get to and where we are today, which is in this direction. Mind you, this is still 2021, which means there are another 3 years after this of amazing developments that we're going to slowly get into. Recent plant thinkers, recent to that time, have looked to affirm via plants precisely the values that Hegel degenerates. For Michael Marder, for example, celebrating plantness entails overturning the core values of autonomy, individualization, self-identity, originality, which underpin Western intellectual traditions. Celebrating, now mind you, listen to this carefully. Celebrating plantness entails overturning the core values of autonomy, individualization, self-identity, originality. Mind you, this sounds, in some ways, could sound like I'm putting them down. This could sound like what I'm trying to say is plants are not autonomous individuals, self-identity, like self-identifying individuals capable of originality. But that's not what he's really saying. What he's saying is plants surely can do this, just like we humans do, but instead focus more on, which is why he says, and instead recovering absolute exteriority and heteronomy, even the collapse of hierarchical dualisms themselves as part of the transvaluation of metaphysical value systems. In other words, I don't know if you can hear, but there's an ambulance, no, or police or something passing. Hold on. Okay, you can pass now. It's coming closer. I love how in Europe, the sound is different depending on where they are. And so they're just passing now, and now they're gone. Okay, sorry about that. So what he's saying is there's nothing short of paradigmatic shift whereby the maximum, man is the measure of all things, is displaced by an increasing awareness of the vegetality of the world. For both Martyr and Galeano, the superficiality of plants demands to be read against the hierarchies of metaphysics. However, Galeano entreaty to attend to the plantness within is not an affirmation of exteriority at the expense of interiority, but rather holds them together. And that's exactly what Martyr was saying before. Martyr is not saying that plants are not, cannot identify the self, that they're not individuals. He's recognizing that they are that. And at the same time, while being that, can also hold the ecosystem, the community, the togetherness to a high standard. And that's the lesson that's super important about recognizing your interior plantness. When I recognize my interior plantness, I am able to be an individual while simultaneously being a part of the whole. And this is the important part. Outward does not replace inwards, but inwardness leads to outwardness, becomes in fact another form of outwardness. This is not just a play on words, although that it is somewhat, but also a contention about what it means to participate in the life of plants and how such participation exposes the contrivance of Western value systems, which presuppose the irreconcilability of inner and outer and the limitations of our intellectual tools. We cannot grasp the plantness within conceptually. It is characterized by what Galeano calls its unthinkability and evades us as soon as we attempt to master it. We must engage it in different ways. And this is, again, another understanding of why in the naturally conscious community, we focus so much on the arts. We focus so much on other aspects of us exploring our inner vegetality, because it helps us tap into parts of ourselves that our logical minds, which have been conditioned and filled with limiting beliefs, are preventing us from accessing. Our beingness doesn't always pass through words. And for this reason, Galeano is talking about unthinkability. Our plantness is not the part that reasons through a wordful logic where there's a hierarchy of things, where instead our plantness is able to absorb the environment of the whole and pass through channels that activate different parts of ourselves, some of which are probably atrophied. Acknowledging plant thinking as an essentialism-free way of thinking, which does not predispose a subject, is the first step in a process of attending to inner and outer plants. This process necessitates both thinking, engaging conceptually and empirically with what we know of plants, and unthinking via practice, experiment, and resisting the reduction of plantness to the symbolic, as well as staging an encounter between the two. Grounded in an awareness that plant thinking disrupts the opposition between thinking and doing, plant thinkers have begun to explore alternative approaches. Galeano, for example, undertook a process of adjustment, spending time with Shipibo Peak community in Peru and practicing in rituals led by the Maestro Vegetalista, which involved isolation and a strict diet supplement by the bark of the Socoba tree. So this is one way, right? It's communion with a plant over a long period of time through what's called a dieta, a plant dieta, which is a relationship that gets built through purification of the body and deep relationship with the plant that allows me to enter into the vegetality world of that plant in a different aspect. And that's one way, right? In the naturally conscious community, in the Sprouts writing and creativity group, we use writing and creativity practices like arts and drawing and all kinds of different pieces of ourselves to, again, further the long-standing relationship we're creating with plants. And this is really important because it starts to change your mind when you give yourself permission and you have a safe space. For Galliano, her safe space was to go and spend time with a shaman, which makes perfect sense, right? She's in this shamanistic environment, this community. She is safe, she's taken care of, and she's doing this. We are replicating that for the modern world with the naturally conscious community. It is your safe environment where you can give yourself that permission to break down what is our humanness only or humanness centric point of view, our animalistic centric point of view, in order to give space for the vegetal part of you, your plantness, your vegetality to emerge. And this is extremely important, as if I'm going to change the paradigm of the world in which we currently live, because you can't really change the paradigm from within it. Galliano contends that the Sokoba provided a teaching session on the nature of reality, which stripped away her preconceived ideas and enabled another way of knowing, grounded in deep listening. Key here is not merely this process on its own, a movement toward unthinking, but rather the way in which Galliano used it to inform her scientific studies on plant communication about her return. She records how her experience with the Sokoba enhanced her ability to hear plants speak. By unbinding her from the prevailing scientific belief systems and empowering her to adopt broad experimental methodologies with her plant associates, right? The whole idea of creating plant partnerships that allow me to escape mechanistic science, mechanistic ways of looking at the world, siloed aspects, and instead to do it from a place of relationship, a place of union and connections, and that redefines terms that we've currently been using and allows us to also coin new terms. Rather than testing existing mechanistic hypotheses which objectified plants. By generating a dialogue between contemporary Western science practice and plant thinking, she tries to resist a nostalgic and fetishistic framing of the plantness within. In his book, Echo Translation, Michael Cronin looks to advance a translation practice grounded in the different domains of ecosemiotics, which we talked about in Biocivilizations, which was one of the books that we read in the Plant Wisdom Book Club. Very interesting book, although not everybody loved it, but it was a great book in my opinion, because it brought in a whole series of different concepts and started to give us, again, another framework for breaking down this mechanistic scientific approach and hierarchical dualisms, or more exceptionalism that we seem to continue to see, and seeing how in the natural world there are other ways to do the same things that we do. In order to depose prevailing translational practices which are rooted in human superiority, he argues that by understanding the world as tratosphere, a vast series of networks containing living and non-living beings which communicate in different ways, we can draw upon a translatory imaginary which does not take the human as its sole reference point to aid cross-species communication. The failures of plant thinking can thus be understood as failures of translation. The vegetal trace, Martyr observes, is all too frequently lost or distorted by its overhasty appropriative translation into human language. Plant thinking as a transformative encounter between the I think of the modern subject and the it thinks of the plant is hard and unfinishable, characterized by an untranslatable remainder. But this incompleteness is also an invitation to vegetal openness, to experience a thinking which defies neurocentrism and anthropocentrism by disrupting the oppositions between inner and outer, mind and body, thinking and feeling. And in my opinion, all of this is what comes down to the idea of being. It is about being, about understanding where I am because I am. And it's so hard for us to put these words to conceptualize these types of things because our society is not built today to give that space where indigenous cultures were, where there were other cultures that embrace this way of beingness and the responses that come, or the understandings or the wisdom that comes from that beingness. And that's really what we're trying to recover right now. So this is finding plantness within ourselves, which I think you will agree with me, it's pretty fucking awesome. Like, it starts to lay the foundation. So let's go to our next place, because I think that this is going to kind of Hello? Why are you? Oh, there it is. Sorry. Let's go to the other paper because I think that this is going to now take what we just read and put us on a whole new level of understanding. Now, this is actually not an article or paper. It's an article kind of, but it's an interview. Now, you've heard me talk about Natasha Myers several times. Natasha Myers is one of my new favorites. She coined the term planthropology. She is an anthropologist who works in the sphere of critical plant studies, and her focus is on, whoa, let's see how I can explain this, getting into the vegetal mind also by, besides the fact that she's done a whole series of work on plant sensing, but it's how do I get into the sensors of the plant and start to live through the sensors of a plant in order to better understand the way plants are and think. I'm hoping she's going to describe this much better than what I just did, but I absolutely love her work. I love her work because she's just the right amount of pissed off at society with the right amount of scientific background to make the leap and the right amount of vision for the future. And I like that edge. She's got an edge. She's got an edge. So let's dive into this. This is okay, there it is. Stories are seeds. We need to learn how to sow other stories about plants. This again was an interview. It was done in, this is an article of Natasha Myers in conversation with Frederik Middelhoff and Arnika Pezelman in 2021. Okay, so Arnika, I'm just going to call her Arnika because Pezelman seems a little too much for me. I don't want to make sure I'm not pronouncing it wrong. Natasha, thank you so much for taking the time. It is a great pleasure for us to have you with us in our conversation about vegetal storytelling. Now, remember, what we just went through was all about vegetal thinking, right? Plant thinking and my beingness inside of that plant thinking. Now we're going to go where what happens and what emerges from that thinking. You are a dancer and a scholar trained in the life sciences and in anthropology, and you have written a widely recognized sensory ethnography on protein modeling, published in your 2015 book, Rendering Life Molecular: Models, Modelers, and Excitable Matter. You demand, however, notice this term, remember I told you she's edgy. You demand, however, that we leave the scientific realm when thinking about plants as sentient because, as you say, the colonial approach evacuates the liveliness and sentience of the more than human world around us. Becoming Sensor was one of the papers that we actually did. So please go back. If you enjoy what we're about to go into, go back into Becoming Sensor because it was amazing. That's where I totally have my scientific crush on Natasha Myers because it was such a good paper. And I love that she's a dancer. It is what helped me re-embody my body and think about plants through the bodily practice. When I do budding artistry, I still have a dream that I'm going to do a budding artistry edition where all we're going to do is move and dance. But I have to warn the group before we do it because budding artistry is usually about drawing, but I really want to do one where all we do is dance because I feel like getting into it. We did one that had a little bit of that when we did one that was connected to our plant past lives, which was awesome. But this is going to take us to a whole nother realm. Okay. Instead, you explore an effective ecology. Together with dancer and filmmaker Ayelen Liberona, hopefully again I pronounced that right, you have developed the art project Becoming Sensor, in which you create an ungriddable ecology of an ancient oak savanna in a park in Toronto. It is meant to explore how non-Indigenous people can become allies to Indigenous resurgence by experimenting with ways to detune the subtler common sense that informs conventional ideas about the living world. One of the aims is to develop new ways of telling stories about land and bodies. These new stories are meant to oppose anthropocentric thinking, including anthropocentric logistics. You suggest disrupting these all too human approaches through planthropocentric actions in the form of plant, people conspiracies, ways people might get outside with plants to grow livable worlds for all. Remember, we were just coming into plant thinking, where through a deep, if you remember, we just said this in the previous article about how intrinsically embodying your plantness then allows me to extrinsically bring that relationship out through a new paradigm. And this is what we're talking about. This is another way, but Natasha Myers is basically doing that. New ways of telling story about land and bodies, new ways of extending out our relationship as beings of nature with other beings of nature, which are plants, but that come from an embodiment to the outside. It's a very different concept. It's very, very subtle, but it's very different. These alternative political and decolonial modes of telling ecological stories and the concepts you have developed, such as Planthropocene, are of particular interest to us for our special edition on the stories plants tell. Before we go into more detailed questions, maybe you would like to tell us about your own story with plants. How did your perception of plants and your interaction with them develop and change over time? So here's where we first get our nice introduction into Natasha Myers. Thanks so much for your question and this opportunity to share. So there was a clear moment for me. Oh, hold on a second. Hold on. I just realized that I'm not doing something that I need to be doing. Give me 1 second. I promise. I know. Me and not being. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Technical things. Okay. Thanks so much for your question, this opportunity to share. So there was a clear moment for me when I was abducted by the plants. It was when I was an undergraduate student in the biological sciences at McGill University. I took a class with a plant physiologist, Professor Rajdindir Dinsa. Hopefully they expect that, like they can appreciate that I tried. And I just remember this remarkable moment when he was teaching us about how flowering plants respond to and remember daily shifts in red light, how plants can sense changes in day length so that they know when to flower. And I suddenly got it. Plants were responding to the red hues of sunrises and sunsets. Has anybody ever heard that before? Because I haven't. And I think that that's amazing. I hadn't thought that. A resonance welled up in my body and imagination as I saw and felt plants collectively bowing to the sunrise and the sunset. I have understood photosynthesis differently since that moment, not as a set of light-activated chemical reaction, but as a kind of reverential cosmic mattering. You see why I have this massive crush on her? This bodily resonance with plants made so much sense to me while I was studying plant biology as an undergraduate and later graduate student in the 1990s. I was also choreographing and performing with small dance companies in Montreal. I started to realize that the depth that I could bring to the questions of what a plant was and what a plant knows had to be explored outside of the lab. I started to learn gestures, movements, and choreography from the plants and embody them to help me think through my research. I do that. That's what this little one over here keeps teaching me. And I am so grateful because I feel like this little one here led me to this. Because yes, I was most definitely led to this discussion. I began to recognize that we needed more than the sciences to engage in meaningful encounters with plants. So it has been since then that my own tissues have been deeply sensitized to plant form, to plant movement, to plant temporalities, their rhythms and tempos. Frederic, forms of moving with and aligning ourselves with plants always involve questions about nonverbal communication and matters of representation. Maybe you could tell us how concepts such as plant language and the notion of plant as storytellers might inform your work. Is this something you find useful or maybe also problematic? Natasha, plants speak to people differently. This is also what we've heard from all the guests on the Plant Wisdom podcast. It's the fact that we each have to create develop our own personal conversation with plants because each language is differently. And we heard this from Evgenia Emmets speaking about it so clearly. And she was saying how she has to listen to each plant that wants to work with her because each one of them speaks in a different way. And then she tells them that her preferred way is dreams. And many of them are able to work with her via the dream realm, but not all. Some aspects, some approach her in different mechanisms that they are more adept to. The stories they tell can be deeply personal, local, and contextual. They may not be for others to hear, or they may be stories that need to be told out loud again and again. Plants speak directly to my body. I encounter plants first and foremost as gestural, expressive dancers, creatively moving with and being moved by all the relations around them. The listening I have been developing requires embodied modalities and meditative engagement. It takes time. And this is a theme we hear over and over and over and over and over again. It takes time. Hence why Evgenia Emmets, one of her big projects is slow down. Relationships with plants take time because really relationships with humans take time. Relationships with all being take time, but we don't give ourselves that time. So slow down. And an ability to let go of conventional ideas of time to learn the speeds and slownessness, the intergenerational and extended space-time of plant tempos and temporalities. Tell me that that's not a gorgeous sentence right there. It involves the work of being with a plant long enough to get a feel for their gesture, to get a feel for their forms and how they are worldling relations all around them. These attunements allow me to listen for and participate in stories about the places plants are making, both right where they are rooted and far beyond. Stories about the relationships with other plants, with the elements, and with other elemental rearrangers, including people. The stories are fundamentally relational. And again, this is a theme we hear over and over again. Plants hold the missing archetypes that humanity has been looking for, and they are all connected to relationships. Our relationships are extremely limited because we think of relationships in this very just narrow, myopic way when we think from our plantness and from our rockness and also from our animalness, and when the relations expand out, there are many more expansive exponential number of relationships that we can create, and the archetypes for those relationships are held within the plant world because they are still practicing them. Kin know relationships. It matters who is doing the listening and what they make it mean. This isn't about finding out the truth of plant propositions, deciphering some universal code, but acknowledging the stories, both mundane and revolutionary, we co-create with them. This listening requires deep work to alter and prepare one's sensorium by detuning colonial norms and attentions, aka eliminating your conditioning. Disciplinary conventions make it hard to have a conversation about whether plants have language or to ask how they communicate or how we can communicate with them. We need different grounds for this conversation. We need especially to start with the shared understanding that our sensing involves more than the 5 senses defined by science. Seriously, is she not just echoing all the things I say? I mean, I love this woman. That sensing is relational and makes worlds, that there is no such thing as an environment out there, that our sensorium articulated in relations with other beings is already more than human, that it enfolds our intuitions, memories, dreams, hopes, desires, pleasures, and horrors. And what we sense and what we cannot sense is conditioned by norms and relations of powers shaped by forces like colonialism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy. And so many more. I can allow, and narcissism and fear-based control, so many other theses. We also must remember that these are the very forces that teach us that our bodies and senses are not to be trusted. Okay, folks, this is an important piece. This is a super important piece because we talk about this all the time. And this is definitely an aspect of a big aspect of my coaching work, of my one-on-one mentorship and coaching, which is you need to learn how to trust yourself. One of my clients is the perfect example of this in this very moment because she is experiencing something that could be extremely scary and traumatic, but she is the type of person that when she knows, she knows. And the decision on what to do about this situation that she is currently in lives within her beingness. And right now, all she has to do is tune into it. And so we have been taught not to trust our bodies. We're supposed to trust external indicators that tell us what's right and wrong and what we should do and not do. But our authentic self, when our plantness and our humanness and all our othernesses unite together, our divineness, we feel that connection and we sense the true answer. We know what direction to take. And this is what is important. So we need to undo that conditioning. So one of the most important things we must do if we want to hear the stories plants tell is to learn to lean into our senses and tune into our intuitions. Those feelings that rise up in our tissues when we resonate with phenomena around us, including phenomena that we can't otherwise see or touch. So obsessed with an objectivity dedicated to removing human error, we reach for machines or algorithms to replace and so delegitimize our sensing. Sensing plant stories requires so much unlearning approaches that alienate us from our more than human kin and render them as objects and resources. Unlearning mechanistic logics and the stark boundaries we assume between bodies. Unlearning what we think sensing in, what we think communication is, what we think counts as a story or as a storyteller, a listener, or a witness. And probably the most blasphemous to academia, the conversation about plant stories is impossible without acknowledging the sacred, the numinous, the subtle, and the energetic elements of plant-people relations. I'm in love. I'm in love. I'm in love. And yes, the sacred is an uncomfortable concept for us in academia. It's been a complicated one for me too, a white settler growing up on stolen lands in so-called Canada. My ancestors were Jews who fled wars and pogroms in Europe to settle in Toronto in the early 20th century. In the early 1970s, my parents rebelled against their suburban Jewish upbringing by dropping out of high school and traveling to Dharamsala to meet the Dalai Lama. My parents sent me to Buddhist meditation camp rather than Hebrew school, and I had profound experiences with meditation while also learning to question Zionism, patriarchal religions, and what people meant by invoking God or the divine. These days, I'm more comfortable recognizing the sacred in my work, even if talking about it makes others uncomfortable. This is what we talk about in Damanhur as the divinization of matter. When I render my actions sacred because they come from a place of inner beauty and inner knowing. That's what it means to render something sacred, to impregnate it, to imbue it with all that is my sense of beingness, which neither makes it right nor wrong. It just makes it whatever it is. These days, I'm more comfortable. Nico Carey, an American artist whose altars and performances create spaces for holding climate grief, defines the sacred in a way that helps me understand it better for myself. He approaches the sacred as the simple act of treating others, including more than human others, how they want to be treated. That feels just right to me, and it hinges on really listening to others, including the plants, for what would count as respectful, reciprocal relationing. Arnica, I wonder what kind of concepts or methods a sensory ethnography can give you, or can give to you, or does it need to be expanded? Natasha, I engaged ethnography as if anthropology were an art, not a social science. And yet, there is nothing innocent about this method. Anthropology's very impulse, its curiosities, its questions are colonial and grounded in white supremacy. Despite all sorts of efforts to decolonize the field, the colonial extractive form persists. In anthropology, we are supposed to reckon with our positionality and privilege, with our relationships to whiteness. I keep wondering, however, whether a discipline like anthropology could be transformed. This is the discipline which, in contrast to so many of the social sciences, takes other ways of knowing, listening, and storytelling so seriously. A discipline which has been so capacious, questioning ethics and reinventing methods. What if instead of fetishizing, collecting, and capitalizing on other people's plant practices, we started learning how to listen to the plants like our own ancestors did? How would this change the questions, the methods, the forms of writing, and the pedagogies of anthropology? I am learning so much working with Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wyandot, Mi'kmaq, and Métis elders and earth workers. Please, I hope I pronounced all of those correctly. Who are talking leadership in the restoration of the lands in Toronto's so-called High Park on Dish with One Spoon wampum lands. One of the things I am learning is that for there to be a relation between a person and a plant, there must be reciprocity. If you are seeking a story, what are you going to give back to the plant? Plant stories are not there for the taking. Stories come when you are in good relation. The question becomes how to get into good relation with the plants and land to learn how to follow these powerful teachers and guides. This is not without appropriating indigenous stories. This is but stories and methods, but waking settlers up to what counts as a good relation here on these lands. I know that these conversations are hard to have in academia, but truly, if we're going to begin to hear the stories plants are trying to tell us, we must get over ourselves and acknowledge that they are not just beings worthy of address, they deserve our reverence. Plants are the ones leading the way in all matters of earth, climate, and trauma healing. We often get stuck contemplating the radical difference of plants. They are so different. They are so other. They are so much less than us. We could not possibly communicate with them. I want us to start from the humbling realization that we are of the plants. They entrained our sensoria, teaching us to smell and taste, inspiring our aesthetics, our sense of form, intoxicating, adorning, and nourishing our bodies, infrastructuring our communities, and fueling economies. They made us human. There's so much I want to I don't want to interrupt the flow because it's just so perfect. And yet at the same time, there's so much I want to say, especially since we have been talking about this. We were looking at this in the plant inspired masterclass where we're having a conversation about what it means to the redefining or the rewriting of the Garden of Eden that we're going through right now, that we're talking about it from this concept of the fact that plants, we come from plants. Therefore, we're part of that relation. Our entire beingness comes from their beingness. A listening practice can start with our effort of rendering our bodies more available to move with and be moved by the plants who have been waiting for us to catch up with them all this time. My own practice involves training myself to be receptive enough to let plants lead me in my activism, theory making, and art making. I've been experimenting with ways to support others learning to listen to plants. I like to bring this practice of detuning the colonial logics of our sensorium into my pedagogy, especially teaching courses on the anthropology of the senses. I created a meditation to help people sense plants otherwise, to help them cultivate their inner plant. It's a hypnagogic visualization that lures a listener to feel through plant forms, processes, and movements. So instead of trying to explain or make an argument for the creativity of plant sensing, this meditation helps people feel it in their tissues. Frederic, regarding matters of attunement, you have also dwelled on concepts such as phytomorphism and insisted on a need to vegetalize our sensorium and our all too colonial ways of making sense. Conceptual, reworked terminology and twisty metaphors are thus an important part of your idea of attunement. But you always approach these games of metaphor in material, semiotic ways, as you acknowledge that we need to build conspiracies with plants and literally cultivate our own inner plant. So, how does the metaphorical inform your tuning in with more than human languages? And this is very connected to what we were just talking about in the last article, right? So Natasha goes on. The words, wait, hold on one second. I'm getting caught up in this. The words really matter. While I was in the laboratory in late 1990s, struggling with the ways that molecular genetics was narrating plant life, I was starting to experiment with other stories, both through dance and in writing. I looked at the data and realized I could tell different stories in order to thwart the deterministic impulse of genetics. It's not easy to rethink the core mechanistic narrative of the life sciences while in the laboratory training to be a scientist. Yes. And yet, I realized that something happens when you begin your narration with the conviction that all beings are sentient and creative. Just think about that for a second. How does that change the way you experience your even everyday life when you come to the understanding that all beings are sentient and creative? All of them. And therefore, we see their expression as creative expression. Take the example of plant tropisms, say phototropism, the phenomena of plants growing toward the lights. You can have a functionalist explanation that enrolls a whole series of mechanisms activated by light as an external stimulus, including a cost-benefit analysis of the energetic economy that drives the organism towards efficiency, which is really the way most scientists do it. But we cannot narrate tropisms, but we can narrate tropisms differently as vegetal intentionality, practicing desire without lack, as curiosity, exploration, play. Mancuso tries to touch on this, but there's very few that are really touching on this aspect. As experiments with light and gravity and vibration, they talk about it in the early shoots when first shoots are coming out. There is this play, this movement of understanding what does my vegetal body look like, act like. I see it. I see it all the time. As vegetal intentionality, practicing desire without lack, as curiosity, exploration, play, as experiments with light and gravity and vibration, you can start to see plants as curious practitioners and as elemental rearrangers at a planetary scale, rather than as machines running code scripts. A different world can be storied. Neo-Darwinism's just so stories of evolutionary prowess are so pervasive. They even lurk inside stories we often think of as liberatory. Neo-Darwinism stories constrain how we understand plants significantly. I think of these stories as lullabies. They are lulling us into a stupor, a deep slumber that makes it impossible to dream life otherwise. I wonder, what could wake us up to other stories? What if you could do ecology, which I want to mean beholding the we of collective being? Collective being. Without neo-Darwinism, what I'm exploring is a difference it makes to expose and reject the functionalism and the universalizing, flattening metrics of the sciences. Yes, it sounds blasphemous to our all too well-trained ears, and I love how uncomfortable it makes people feel when this consensus in science is breached. My scholar activism then is about activating the rupture, breaking that conventional sense, making structure. Left unexamined, our common sense will continue to render these plants as objects. I hate the term common sense. I hate it. I hate it. There is no such thing as common sense, nor should there be. It is always has to be contextualized to the moment. Subjects to our whim. It takes some effort to recognize and root out these narrative forms as at work within the plant stories people still find so salient. And one of the reasons I'm looking towards artists is that they are not constrained by the same narrative forms as scientists. Hence why we're seeing so many art science people in coming to the forefront of this, because it takes the arts to get us out of that mechanistic thinking. Sure, artists also fall into similar ruts, especially when they are caught in the thrall of science with all its expertise, status, and technology, and grant money. And grant money. But there is room for invention in art, and I want to be room in academia for the ruptures in praxis that art makes possible. Frederic, you're looking for alternative methods to tease out and express the stories you want to tell with and about plants. Can you give us more detail on how you make use of sensorial, kinesthetic, multimedia practices, interlinking academic writing, photography, smelling protocols, and activist approaches? Yeah, I want to know what these alternative practices are. The renderings that I make with my longtime friend and collaborator, Ayelen Liberona, in our project Becoming Sensor are meant to generate ecological data, but not the kind of data forms we are used to. Meaningful data for us must encompass the fullness of an effectively charged, embodied encounter with the land. Our experience with the plants over the seasons and the years on one small patch of land in so-called High Park are all part of an archive, part of an ungriddable ecology. We've gathered the restory these already deeply storied lands. These lands have been storied since creation by indigenous people. Now they are storied most prominently by settlers and their sciences. At the core of this work is an understanding that the ecological sensorium settlers inherit from the sciences has already prefigured these lands as a collective of discrete species where nature is figured as resonance. Ecological restoration projects here calculate ecosystem services and hinge on chemical intensive protocols. And so, at the core of our artwork is a desire to rupture the metrics, the norms, and the grids that enforce colonial forms of land management, to make strange the scientific impulse long enough to allow other stories to thrive. And I think that this is it's so what we need to see more of across the sciences, right? There should be a play, a flow, better word, a flow between these types of sensorial experiences that allow other stories to emerge, which in some cases are metaphysical in nature, and they're going to be considered things like even channeling, because it is. If today we don't know how to label all of our other senses, if science hasn't put a label to the way that we input things, then of course my output is going to be labeled with a non-scientific term: metaphysics, channeling, telepathy, all these types of aspects. But that is because we have yet to fully understand the capabilities of the human experience, and because of that we cannot recognize what other kin have as ways to express to us and for us to receive that expression. So it makes perfect sense that these types of programs have to flow in a different way, and hence why artists are the perfect storytellers to work with the scientific community to move this. And Natasha Myers happens to be both, because being a dancer, she is both artist as well as scientist. How can detuning the sciences shift the stories we tell about plants? It changes everything. Suddenly, it's not about organisms' energetic efficiency in complex environments, something that drives me nuts about the way people talk about plants. It's about relations of power that involve people. Think about the movement of plants across empires. All those plants were extracted from deeply embedded relationships with people. We need to talk about these forms of dispossession in ecology, plants and people, plants, plant people and human people. I think it's a better way of saying this, wrenched out of relation. And so Turning down the volume on scientific stories allows us to alter how settlers apprehend these stories, these lands, where apprehension is understood not only as a perception, but also as a form of capture. As activism, this artwork is about activating an altered settler sensorium, disrupting ways of sensing and storing lands to help white settlers see the dispossessions their privileges leverage. We approach this as a first step towards becoming better allies to ongoing Indigenous resurgence and sovereignty projects. We engage art making as a way of tuning into the land to hear stories that would otherwise be muted or ignored. This is such an important sentence because today all of these stories are being lost because we no longer have the mechanisms for receiving them. And those that do receive them are afraid to publish them if they are receiving them while in an academic or a scientific realm because they feel like they cannot justify them. And so therefore those stories are being lost because we know that plant scientists are receiving, but only those that have given themselves permission to explore their own sensorial world, to open up to other forms of receiving, are able to then express that through the traditional scientific models. The protocols and the practices we developed help us to ground ourselves in the land long enough to be able to listen. And powerfully, one of the first demands for reciprocity that we hear from the Oaks was for us to get into good relation with Indigenous earth workers to support their land sovereignty work here on their ancestral lands. So now, after a few years of working with an amazing group of people who have gathered to form the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle, I can understand art making as our first step in a slow and deep form of land acknowledgement. It was a practice that seeded our relations with Indigenous land protectors and earth workers and also taught us how to be in reciprocal relation with the land. Mind you, this is also an important aspect because when you go to do this type of work, as she has mentioned it, but I don't know if it was as explicit, which is it's very easy, especially for her coming from a white heritage. Even this happens in myself, right? I am Cuban American, as you all know, but my parents and probably are about third, maybe fourth generation Cuban. We don't actually know. But before that, it was Spain, right? We're also colonizers, massive colonizers. Dang, Inquisition. And so therefore, I don't claim to have in my first person the ancestral indigenous parts of my land's wisdom, right? Of my Cuban ancestry. If I was to approach that, I'd have to find a way to work with who I am and to open myself to other forms of relating to that land in order for the Taino and for all the other peoples of that land originally, because my people displaced them, right? And so it is important to recognize that part of what she's doing is not just creating relations with the land for her own sake, but also to be able to work with Indigenous without appropriating what the Indigenous do, the Indigenous peoples of those lands do, but instead for her to have developed what probably her own white ancestors did not give themselves the opportunity to develop. So it is a different approach coming from her own cultural background, in her case, dance. And everything she learned from dance and everything she appreciated from dance, right? She's able to then bring that in and form a relationship with Indigenous that doesn't use their mechanisms, but instead she has developed her own that are in harmony and then can also create bonds with what the Indigenous elders are doing in that land. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know if that's clear, but hopefully it is. This is really important because I think that we hear a lot about people who try to become close to Indigenous elders and to Indigenous peoples, and then we start hearing about appropriation and colonization and all these different aspects. You need to take your time to develop your own practices that come from your own cultural background, and then work with the Indigenous peoples, if you're not Indigenous, and the indigenous peoples to me are also the plants, by the way, and the animals of the land and all this, but then to work with them and form new relations. Hopefully that was clear. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Like if you have any questions or comments as we go along, please always, the chat is there for you for exactly that reason. Plant stories are deeply political and are shot through with power. Plants play an integral role in stories of indigenous genocide, transatlantic slavery, and the exploitation of migrant labor. The fact that dish with one spoon lands were enclosed as an urban park for white settlers' leisure and pleasure must be counted among the violences of colonization here. Parks in settler states are by definition sites of dispossession, invented and designed to keep indigenous people off the land. What members of the circle have taught me most poignantly is how parks and their policies are obstacles to the land-based learnings and ceremony that are essential for indigenous people healing from the intergenerational effect of colonial violence. So Frederick asks, in an interview published in 2020, you mentioned that the stories we need to be reading are those that can activate and help us grow livable worlds. These are the stories being told by Black, Indigenous, people of color, activists, artists, activists, writers, scholars, gardeners, earth workers, and their allies. Shortly beforehand, the interview had brought up Richard Powers' The Overstory, which has become a popular novel not only in literary plant studies communities, but you said that this is not what you are looking for because the plant people in the novel are effectively swallowed up or destroyed by a world committed to extractive capital. Sorry. I just want this on the record. That when we read The Overstory in the Plant Wisdom Book Club, we didn't love it. Not because of exactly that. Everybody talks about this as being a story about plants, but it's not. It's a horrible story in some ways about human beings that the only one that really sort of, the couple was one of the only ones that really was more about the plants in some ways. But all the others was about the humans. Sure, they have an encounter with plants. Sure, there are trees but it's not really about, it claims to be plants in first person, but it's not. It's still all humans in first person. It's all humans in first person. The plants are objects. So is there any kind of fictional work out there that you think he didn't like his characters? That's it. Michelle just said it perfectly. He didn't like his characters and plants were incidental. That is how we felt about the book. Because yes, I agree. And so the question that gets asked is there any kind of fictional work out there that you think tells a story that activating the sense of your envision? Yes, there are. There are some. And now, of course, I've just blanked on the name that I was about to say. Oh, my goodness. Remind me of the book that we love so much by the New Zealand author. It'll come to me in a minute. Give me a second and I'll tell you. Yggdrasil, The Return of the Yggdrasil. The Return of the Yggdrasil. Sorry, Michelle just reminded me that it was Return of the Yggdrasil. Go read Return of the Yggdrasil. It's one of the few books that really is from the plant perspective. There are some others that we've read in there. Go check it out. But Return of the Yggdrasil. The real work, says Natasha, lies in listening to the people who refuse to let colonization disrupt the depth of their sacred conspiracy with plants. The most compelling writing for me is coming from Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, a Anishinaabe writer, artist, musician, and poet from Alderville First Nation, whose brilliant works of theory, of fiction, poetry, and song are called, hold on, I want to write that one down. Whose brilliant works of theory, fiction, poetry, and song are a call for indigenous resurgence and land-based learning. I am moved especially by her writing on sugar maples and her recent novel, Nooping, Noopiming, The Cure for White Ladies. We might have to add that to our list. Whose experimental form opens up and transforms what we think a novel is or what a story can do to the world. Her writing speaks directly to her kin, and yet non-Indigenous readers can experience in her works a deep rupture in what we take as given, opening us up to feel the traumas and injustice of colonization, and reminding us that we should all be grieving the harms white privilege imposes on Black and Indigenous lives. There are also powerful stories about plants being told by Black studies scholars around land-based reparations and food justice for those whose ancestors were enslaved. Catherine McKittrick, Tiffany Lethabo King, and Ruth Wilson Gilmer, among others, teach us how land dispossession, and anti-Blackness has been structured into food systems, farms, cities, and gardens. They help me see multiple dispossessions in the racial capitalism of slavery. Enslavement and land theft severed Black and Indigenous peoples' relationships with the plant of their homelands and forced enslaved people into injurious relations with plants on plantations. So, reading these scholar activists helps detune settler sensoria and colonial common sense about land, plants, and capitalism. These are not feel-good stories, but holding these stories is part of an essential work we need to do too, so that we can remind all the white people who think they are doing good by creating pollinator gardens in their wealthy neighborhoods to save the bees, that environmental justice heals nothing if it hinges on racial injustice. Just let that phrase sink in for you. Environmental justice heals nothing if it hinges on racial injustice. What we need now is to tear down the fences enclosing private gardens on stolen land in settler states, and in the case in Europe, gardens grown with stolen wealth. Yes. To make room for BIPOC communities to rekindle their relations with land. We need to hear the stories that show us how the flourishing of Black and Indigenous lives is integrally bound up in the flourishing of the bees and the healing of lands. So true. Stories are seeds. We need to learn how to sow other stories about plants. The stories I want to read about people who learn how to conspire with the plants to heal our relations and one another and with the earth. We need to learn how to get on side with plants and grow worlds that are livable for all. And so critically, for Planthropocene to take root, for a thickening of plant-people solidarities, we need to dismantle the economies, infrastructure, and relations that uphold white privilege and power. We need to learn to recognize that human and more than human futures demand we all step into our responsibilities to the land and to reimagining our communities and relationships starting in our gardens. I love this. I love this. And again, this is why the nationally conscious community was created, right? We need spaces for us to be able to have these conversations freely and opening, but more than anything, to give us space to be vulnerable enough to say, I don't know how to do this. I need help. Let's work together. Let's try new things. I had this experience with, sensorium. I cannot, with some part, some sense of me that I don't even recognize, and I don't know what to do with it because I don't know where to put it. And for others to say, you don't have to put it anywhere. You just have to be it, live it, let it be a part of you. And I appreciate and love and am so enthralled by everything we do in the naturally conscious community, because I feel like it's the space where we can have these conversations, where we can play and approach things with curiosity, where we can invite a plant into the conversation and we can ask plants, as I'm looking around and I'm looking at Zan and Jaina and all the other plants that have yet to even give me names, and say, what do you think about this? And get that feedback, where we can say, my plant is dying and I feel horrible because I don't know what to do. And I have tried everything and I'm getting this feeling that this plant just wants to die. Or the opposite, I get this feeling that I've been a horrible, caregiver in the plant that lives with me. And therefore I feel from the plant that he is trying to teach me to do better. Or I'm walking down the street and I get yelled at by purslane coming through the cracks somewhere who's giving me information that I need for my future, for my life right now, or about that location in which Key is living. There's just so much here, and we need places where we can explore these concepts. Frederic, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and insight. That was really incredibly exciting. Wow, I didn't realize that we were already at the end. So here's a little bit about Natasha Myers, if you're wondering, is a scholar, activist, and artist living in Dish with One Spoon lands in Toronto, Canada. She is an associate professor of anthropology at York University in Toronto and director of Plant Studies Collaboratory, an intentional node for artists and scholars seeding plant people conspiracies. Plant Studies. I want to write that down. Plant Studies Collaboratory. All right. I really want to check that out. So, what'd you think? What'd you think? Pretty awesome, right? I mean, this is why I love Natasha Myers, and I think that this interview is really great. Hold on. I want to go back to the top. I don't even know where this was published. Whoosh, sorry. Can you go bookmark? Can you away? I don't need you. Okay. So this was actually first published, which doesn't really say, Muse, York Libraries. All right. I don't know where it was actually published. I have to go look and see if I have it in my notes. But stories are seeds. We need to learn how to sow other stories about plants. Do you now see why I have such a scientist crush on Natasha Myers? I mean, in this world, she is one of the ones that is speaking my language, because Galeano, which we read about in the last article, right? In the previous article where we were talking about plantness, Galeano approaches it still very much with a scientific mind. I don't know how to explain it. I was a very big fan of Galeano, and then I got into some areas where I was like, I see what she's trying to say, and she's actively working in academia in a different way, and she still wants to carry out research, which is very different. But I feel like still, even she herself, right? She's going into these sort of indigenous practices. But I love that Natasha is coming at it from a place of deep reverence and saying, I don't want to appropriate anything. I need to develop my own. And I think that that's the part of it that I love about Natasha Myers so much. I love that she is saying, I want to create my own relation. And like she said, sow new stories, like sow new seeds that come up with stories that are based on my cultural expression, being the conditioning of that part being stripped away, which we talk about all the time, right? I mean, this is what I love about my one-on-one clients in particular, is that there we can get in to specifically what are the conditionings and the beliefs and the limiting beliefs that are coloring the way that you approach the world. And then from there, with lots of gentleness and with lots of help from the plants, strip that away to get to that essence that I was talking about that will reveal your plantness, but your humanness too, which is a form of animalness. And we'll also probably discover your rockness and your divineness and all these pieces that start to then allow you to connect into yourself, to all these different parts, which each one of them has an intrinsic connection to other kin, right? And so therefore, my whole sense of being, who I am, my personalities, my soul structure, all deconstructs and therefore reconstructs based on not me trying to adopt somebody else's, but instead me identifying my own self and my own parts. And I love that so much. This is the reason. This is the reason why, as you can tell, this is the reason why I love this work. I love this work. I love this. I love this research. I love this experience. I love who I become. And I love to watch who you become. I love it. I love to watch who you become as we go through this process, because I don't know who that is. Each one of us is going to be something different. Each one of us is going to have collective pieces that fit into the overall ecosystem and yet express an individuality. No two plants are exactly the same, right? Each one has its own nicks and way of growing, and thorns over here and roots over there and all these different aspects. And that's exactly what we're trying to get to. Can you just imagine how amazing our world is going to be when we get there? Can you just imagine? Can you just imagine? Take a second and think about it. Think about how fantastic our world will be when we finally are able to lead from this space, to feel our collective unity while still feeling completely empowered as an individual. Oh my goodness, it's amazing. All right. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free. Like, you can post a comment right now, post a comment. If you're watching this on the replay, we love everybody who's watching the recording. Please, drop me a line, come into the Naturally Conscious community, come in and have this conversation with us, because, this is an important conversation to have. And this deconstruction that she's talking about, she's talking about it a little bit. She says that there's horror in it, and she does say that the stories are not all beautiful, but it's messy, man. Let's be honest. Some of this stuff is messy, because when you break down your own conditioning, you have to recognize the things that you've been doing your whole life, things that you've been believing about yourself and about others and about the way of the world, isn't necessarily accurate. And there is grief. That's the reason why I did, this episode 70 of the Reconnect with Plant Wisdom podcast is about what nature teaches us about grief, because we need to grieve. We need to grieve our colonial ways. We need to grieve the world that we've created. We need to give ourselves space to grieve parts of ourselves that have yet to be able to emerge. And when they start to emerge, we need to grieve the parts of ourselves that we've had to shed or transform and evolve. We need to grieve. We need to give ourselves space to grieve. We need to learn how to grieve in order to do that. So, powerful words from Natasha Myers. I need time. I need time to digest all of this. Oh, thank you so much for being here. I am always I'm so appreciative for your presence, for your views, for everything that you experience, and especially for your comments and your questions and your thoughts. And I am very much looking forward to having you in the Naturally Conscious community, where you can resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance and just let it all out. Let it all shine out. So I hope you enjoyed this week's plant consciousness commentary. I'm excited for what's coming next. We're in good part of our story. So have a wonderful weekend. Have a beautiful time, no matter where you are, everywhere in the world. And again, please leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts and what you were thinking and what comes up for this for you. And I'll see you inside the Naturally Conscious community. This is me, Tigria Gardenia. I'm out. Bye.